Joining me now to talk about energy policy, which is one of the issues that is most driving inflation, whether or not we know it or not, is the president of the AXPC, the CEO, I should say, the American Exploration and Production Council, Anne Bradbury. Anne, welcome to the Dan O'Donnell Show. Really do appreciate you joining us.
Thanks, Dan. It's great to be with you.
So before we begin, what exactly does your organization do?
Sure. So AXPC represents the largest oil and gas producers in the United States. So our companies are responsible for well over half of all domestically produced oil and natural gas in the U.S. We like to say we're responsible for the American energy revolution that's occurred over the last decade or two.
So domestic energy production was a big priority of the Trump administration. Of course, we were energy independent for the first time in a long time. And then when candidate Joe Biden started saying, I'm going to kill domestic energy, I want to kill the oil industry because it pollutes, all of that, your member organizations and companies had to be saying, well, this isn't great, right?
So, the last three and a half years have been really challenging for the industry. We've seen every agency across the federal government in regulatory overdrive, putting out regulations that drive up the cost of production. We've seen fewer leases issued by this administration than any administration, Republican or Democrat, in generations. And so it's made it harder to produce oil and gas in the U.S., more expensive to produce oil and gas in the U.S. And unfortunately, all that does is drive up the costs for the American people and empower our adversaries like Russia and Iran.
How important is it for America to be energy independent because of exactly what you said?
It's essential. Because America is now the leading oil and gas producer, we are able to enjoy lower and more stable energy prices than much of the world. But not only that, we've been a huge force for good in the world by exporting some of our energy to our allies around the world to make the world a more stable place. So, 50 years ago, when there was unrest in the Middle East, the United States faced, a crisis in the economy and shortages at the gas pumps. And because the U.S. is now the biggest producer of oil in the world, we're certainly impacted by those events, but there's a huge buffer. And the American people now don't feel those overseas conflicts as acutely as we did in the past few decades.
So over the past 3 years, we have seen this massive regulatory spike that has led to not just a huge increase in the price of gas, unleaded and premium and the like, that, of course, peaked in the summer of 2022. President Biden was forced to tap into the Strategic Petroleum Reserve, not for a geopolitical strategy, but for a political strategy to keep gas prices as low as possible heading into the 2022 midterms. I think what hasn't quite been as sharp a focus for anyone, myself included, is the massive spike in the cost of diesel and how much that has contributed to overall inflation as companies are forced to pay far more to transport their goods across the country. Do you believe also that the increased cost of diesel is what has been a primary driver of food inflation and goods inflation?
Absolutely. Energy, oil and natural gas are foundational to every aspect of our economy. So when the price of diesel goes up because the price of crude goes up, that increases transportation costs, it increases fertilizer costs, and all of these lead to higher food costs. It leads to higher manufacturing costs. Because the price of energy goes up, so the price of all these goods, services, and foods go up as well. So energy is really a driver behind inflation. And when regulatory policies and pipelines are canceled, making it harder to transport oil and gas, come out of this administration, it absolutely increases energy prices and then drives up the cost of all these other goods and services across the board.
Do you believe this has been a concerted effort that President Biden has been making good on his campaign promise to sort of choke the American energy industry in the interests of, cutting down on greenhouse gas emissions or solving climate change?
We both heard what, candidate Vice President Biden said when he was running, that he was going to shut down, fracking in the United States. One of his, earliest executive orders was to take a whole of government approach to climate change, which we have really seen as an anti-oil and gas agenda. So I do think that there has been some very intentional policies to make it harder and more expensive to produce oil and gas in America. What's ironic about that, though, is that emissions actually decreased more during the first 3 years of the Trump administration than they have under the first 3 years of the Biden administration. Because what, the Trump policies recognized is that you can have both a robust energy sector and increased oil and gas production and drive down emissions, because the United States produces some of the cleanest and most responsible oil and natural gas in the world, and these are global commodities.
There has been a contention on the left that what is driving inflation, particularly energy inflation, has been price gouging on the part of oil companies, that they have seen record high profits and that they're, in fact, preying on the American consumer. Is there any truth to that?
There is no truth to that. And in fact, I would say they're, trying to shift blame. But the fact is that oil and natural gas are global commodities, and that these prices are set in the global marketplace. The U.S. is responsible for about 15% of global production, but the United States is also responsible for about half of all new global production since COVID. So U.S. energy producers are doing our part to keep energy prices low by increasing production and putting more supply into the marketplace. Unfortunately, the policies coming out of this administration and from Democrats in Congress are making that more and more challenging.
She is Anne Bradbury, the CEO of AXPC, joining me here on the Dan O'Donnell Show. Anne, thank you so much. I really do appreciate you and coming on the show, and especially debunking that last one, because I can remember back in the summer of 22, that's all liberal callers and people responding to posts I would make on social media or something like, well, it's price gouging. It's price gouging. It's big oil once again. There really isn't a whole lot of truth to that, because aren't the margins for oil production smaller than one might think because of the high costs of it?
They are, and the biggest contributor to the price of gas at the pump is the price of crude oil. And the only way to bring that number down is to put more crude into the global marketplace to increase supply. So, absolutely sympathize with folks who feel the pain every time the price at the pump goes up. But it's not a matter of price gouging. It's a matter of bad policies.
Anne Bradbury, thank you so much. Really do appreciate it. We'd love to have you back on again if you would be so kind.
Absolutely, Dan. It's been a pleasure.